My name is Paul Laffoley, and the last name is spelled L-A-F-F-O-L-E-Y. The name itself I discovered the first time that I went to Europe, or to Paris. You know, this was in 1965. So I'm going out, and I'm walking around. The first since I was kind of near Notre Dame, I thought that would be the first place I'd go to. And then I noticed a couple with photographic equipment, and you know, taking pictures of the gargoyles and everything. And they said, they motioned to me, and at first I thought they wanted me to take their picture next to the gargoyles. I said, no. They were French, and so we were having a communication problem there. And they said, we want to photograph you next to this gargoyle. And I said, what? And I said, why? He says, because you're connected to this gargoyle. And I said, they explained what they were doing is that they were going to the University of Paris, and they were doing an essay on that there were real models for these gargoyles. And I said, okay, that may be true, but I'm not from around here. I'm from Belmont, Massachusetts, and I've only been here like a day. So I couldn't possibly, or anybody that I know couldn't be connected with it. And then they said, well, what is your name? And so I told him my name. He says, Laffoley. He said, yes, you're one of those. And I said, one of what? He said, do you know what your name means? And I said, no. I thought, you know, you get your name, and you start growing up, you're using it, and you don't really question it. And he said, it means the mad ones. In the 9th and 10th century, that the nobles would place their offspring that were wacky in one of these convents, and so that today they would be autistic, epileptic, catatonic, you know, what have you, some schizophrenic, some paranoid, you know, something that today now has nomenclature attached to it. But at that point, they simply wanted to get them out of the family. And these children were delivered and devoid and completely disconnected from their family name. In a certain sense, they did get a defined name. They were nuts, you know. And so that they said that these people turned out to be in the world of the High Gothic, you know, like a premium, because they were fabulous models. Don't forget, this is, say, like just before the Renaissance started, before individualism became prominent. The world of the High Gothic was where everybody in heaven was the same. All angels look alike, all the saints looked alike. And so when you look at Notre Dame and the carvings of the saints and the angels, they're all the same. They're completely stereotypical. The things that are individual are the gargoyles, the uniqueness. Because somebody who's crippled, who's in constant anxiety, you know, is going to look different than other people. And so they wanted to have this as the symbol of evil, because the idea of the gargoyle at that time was that evil was everywhere, even around and involved with the cathedral, with the church itself. I looked like the one that they called the devil, you know, which is right on the corner, you know, with the tongue hanging out and stuff like this, you know, and the kind of dull look of a trapped animal, you know, like that. So they said that some of your ancestors must have been involved in this.
This is a picture of Paul Laffoley. Paul's an architect, and he's also an artist, but that doesn't quite explain him. This photograph might be the best representation of Paul because he is so indescribable. To start to understand who Paul is, you must begin to understand how he thinks. For example, there's an inscription on the snapshot that reads, "Extraterrestrials often appear as ghost-like forms or diaphanous amoebae surrounding the person being contacted." There are 3 positions to take on this picture. Number 1, dismiss it as a mistake made by the camera and call Paul Laffoley insane. This is the easiest stance to take. Number 2, interpret it as art. This would broaden our horizons and find deeper meaning in the aesthetics of the picture, while still framing it safely within the land of make-believe. Number 3, actually believe that Paul Laffoley has been in contact with an extraterrestrial. This would question everything we think we know about science, religion, and philosophy. This is exactly what Paul is asking us to do. It's also the most difficult and unpopular idea to accept. However, for the duration of this film, we must entertain this notion. This is the interior of the Boston Visionary Cell. It's a cramped 18 by 30 foot utility room where Laffoley lives and works. At first glance, this place looks like a graveyard for esoteric antiques. But out of the clutter of what could be a forgotten attic springs forth the blueprints for ideas and inventions. Laffoley paints and writes on large canvases to broadcast his theories to the rest of the world. Despite their enormous size, it's a painstaking task to fit in all the information that needs to be conveyed to the viewer.
Before I do the actual painting, of pictures in that way, is I'm getting all these other things done that surround it, so that'll speed the process up, and I'll know it's all there, and so when I paint these things, it actually can go faster, because if you're doing these things, you say, I got to have all this other stuff done, because you can destroy your energy by continual marathons, which end up being unproductive. The way it works for me is that I'm backed up in my head with a lot of stuff, and so it appears to people as if I have no downtime. I deal with the idea of expressing the force structure of the mystical experience. People have often challenged me on the concept of being a visionary artist. Okay, because they're coming from the definition of the word as a superlative. Like a mediocre artist, very good artist, really great artist, and then visionary artist, like that. And so that when people would describe Buckminster Fuller, You know, he's described as a visionary person. They're using it as a superlative. I don't think he ever used that to describe himself. And anyone who's involved in the sacred and the holy in some fashion are actually utilizing the concept of visionary art, which is an eternal genre. I mean, somebody who's had a mystical experience and then decides to become an artist is going to be involved in the visionary genre, regardless of how good they are. I mean, there's a lot of mediocre visionary artists. But if you look at the history of visionary art, you can go back to Hellenistic Rome and see the same types of things going on. And you go back Henri Fuseli, then you look at the Mannerist period in the Italian Renaissance. That was a high visionary genre period. Like you could say Blake is, but Blake didn't use the word, but he's part of the genre. A lot of the surrealists were involved in it. Now, what I claim is that the visionary genre keeps in other words, has allowed in the modern sense, has allowed symbolism and surrealism to exist. In other words, it is like a carrier wave, and it's a carrier wave through history. I mean, normally a genre means that it's historically bounded, like 19th century English landscape painting. You know when it started and you know when it ended. This is a different thing. In other words, it's like something that comes down once in a while. It's like part of my theory of natural singularities. And then these are singularities in history.
Laffoley's work can be classified as a semiotic operating system. His paintings are arranged into groups of symbols. Each symbol will potentially lead to another, like squares traveling around a board game. This is a painting called The World Soul of Plotness. It was featured in a show by Laffoley called Portaling. The night before the exhibit opened, the artist fell from a 20-foot ladder and broke both of his legs. One became infected to the bone, and it had to be amputated. He now relies on a prosthetic limb.
Here?
Yeah, it's a squeaky.
Yeah. So it actually works like a chocolate solver.
This is an artificial leg created for Laffoley by a group of special effects artists in Hollywood. It's the paw of Leo, his zodiac sign.
So what I did is they said, send me a prosthetic that you probably don't care that much about, like that, because this is a better one than that. So I wear this on special occasions.
Paul Laffoley's first word was Constantinople. He spoke it at 6 months and then didn't say another word until he was 4. Soon after, doctors diagnosed him as slightly autistic, and Paul began to get into art. Later, he was given 8 electroshock treatments during his senior year at Brown University.
And in 1992, when my teeth started falling out, I was going in for dental implants. The guy said, well, I can't use those little tiny x-rays. You're going to have a CAT scan of your head. And so the guy's putting me through there, and he starts asking me questions like, do you ever have your neck broken? And I said, no. He said, you ever been shot? And I said, why are you asking me these questions? He said, well, there's something in your head. And I said, what's in my head? I said, I hope it's brains. And then he said, no, there's something else besides brains. And he says, there's a thing that looks like a bullet in your head. And I said, what do you mean? What is it? About 3/8 of an inch long, 1/16 of an inch in diameter, and rounded at both ends. I've never had any pain in my head. I get no, I've never had a headache in my life, And so this, whatever this is, it's never given me any pain. He said, well, that's interesting. I happen to belong to MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. And there was a chapter in Waltham. And he said, I'm going to send these x-rays over and let a physicist look at this. That's a ventricle. But usually, you see, in other words, there's a lot of ventricles in here, but they don't show up because there's nothing in there but spinal fluid. In there. So here I just put a circle around it, so people could see it. That looks like something that's partially mechanical and partially alive. Any civilization only 1,000 years older than we are would have commercialized nanotechnology and would made it into not totally mechanical things but biomechanical things. People have thought that a lot of my ideas are coming from another civilization in the sense of they're testing our worldview. Because if you say you want to go billions and billions of light years away, why? You could send this, have this receiving mechanism. It wouldn't be like bird banding, because what the hell do they care what's going on in a little speck of light? They want to know whether we're worthwhile to eat. Are they ahead of them, behind them? What's going on? So they just drop a few ideas in and see how the civilization responds. Every once in a while, I have my head x-rayed.
You could say that Laffoley's in poor health. He's physically handicapped and has been diagnosed as mentally ill. To many, this life could be a depressing state, but Paul has created something positive out of it. He has become the literal embodiment of the Sphinx. He's half man, half lion. He possesses a mutant brain that is capable of creating riddles on a higher plane. Paul has transformed himself into a superhero. The artist claims that he was visited by an extraterrestrial who revealed to him how to link life to death in a continuous experience, travel faster than the speed of light, and move the entire universe to the 5th dimension. These ideas are depicted in Thanaton 3, an interactive painting. By touching the hands and staring into the eye, the artwork will feed the participant new information. Like many of Laffoley's pieces, this one's overall design is created out of one or more golden rectangles. By subdividing one, a logarithmic spiral can be created. This is mathematically expressed as phi, or the divine proportion. This geometry is found throughout nature, but Laffoley believes that phi is only present in mature forms. This means that when a child is still growing, its body cannot be expressed through the divine proportion. It's only after passing through adolescence that phi is present. It's at this point that Laffoley claims that the body begins to die. What follows is Laffoley's autobiographic passage through life. Paul's a storyteller. His delivery can be densely packed with facts, and taking it all in is sometimes hard to digest. But this style reflects the savant character of Paul Laffoley. His rambling words have the hypnotic quality of a dream. This film contains only Laffoley. Any additional interviews with his friends or foes would break that spell, and we would end up back in our own everyday reality. Instead, we will journey deep into the world of Paul's mind, where his ideas thrive unaffected by the outside world. Every story has a beginning, and this is how Paul Laffoley starts.
I was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and about one day after I was born, the clinic I was born in burned down. This was the lying-in hospital, a clinic connected with the Mount Auburn Hospital in Cambridge. I was practically born in the car, you know, so that my mother was put into this place, and they said, well, don't even send the doctor over, you know, because he's already here. And so the birth was pretty easy, and so the next day I'm out of there, and then this is my parents telling me the hospital burned down. Not just the clinic. They've left the land vacant where this occurred. They never rebuilt it right there, and so that they have actually no record of my birth. That had to be constructed. You know, people going to the city hall and verifying that I was this, that, and the next thing. I don't know what it signifies, but later on, every place that I would have a studio where I'd be kicked out of, the place burned down. Not by me, but as a general thing. And I think it's probably a psychic security issue of where suddenly you're thrust into the everyday world, and then the place that you were thrust into is now gone. We moved after like about 6 months. We moved to Belmont, which is in a neighboring town. And as I grew up in Belmont, the fire indication occurred when I was about probably 8 years old. Across at that time, Belmont was a farm country, or just was the end of it. Like the suburbs had. This is the 50s, and they were developing in that way. To the outside world, it was as right-wing, conservative, you know, as you could possibly imagine. Like, I lived 2 streets away from Robert Welch, who started the John Birch Society. And you go up Douglas Road, and then right here was where Robert Welch's house was. And so every morning he'd stand with his toes right at the edge of the sidewalk on you know, his property line, and he'd have little American flags all lined up, and you know, he'd be saying, "Good morning, children. Which would you like? Would you like coconut or would you like fudge?" And he'd be having boxes. He'd be handing these candy bars out. And he said, God, you know, save America, God bless America, and said, and go to school and learn the right way. And he would do this every single day. So you'd see all the kids that were going to this school would end up lining up on the street so they could get these candy bars. I went to the Mary Lee Burbank School. Now, it was a strange mixture of conservatism and liberalism, because I went to a progressive school, you know, developed on John Dewey's methods. You know, like you learn how to go to the store, you know, which was a very surprise to me, because I wanted to learn to read and write. And then across from my house was a farm called the Phippen Farm, and there was a small house that I'd always been attracted to, and it turned out it was a house where the children of the Phippins were brought up in. You know, meaning this was a time when like children were separated or was coming out of the situation where children were not allowed to be involved in an adult house. So this is where they could do anything, you know, climb the walls and all this kind of stuff. Even in their own house, they had special staircases for children, so it was a separated thing. And I was always fascinated by this little house. And so old lady Phippen came out one day when I was wandering around and says, "You stay away from that house. Get away from that house." Next day, the house burned down. She blamed me. And my father's out talking to her, you know, getting cash out of his wallet. He assumed that I had burned the house down.
Perhaps one of the strongest influences in Paul's formative years was his father. Paul's dad had a unique philosophy that combined conventional classical sensibilities with unconventional esoteric beliefs.
I had a father who was super responsible. My father was the vice president of a bank. My father had, he literally had another life, and which he felt didn't interfere with his life of super responsibility. But it was things like he literally did not believe in gravity. And all our father and son arguments, you know, which is the usual that happens with sons and their fathers, is that they would all center on the fact that he felt that I was starting to believe in gravity and therefore was being duped by the system. I was 9 years old in the third grade, and science begins. And so the teacher assigns different things to people. You know, like somebody got how the nose works, what is the use of salt, you know, this kind of stuff. You know, random distribution of scientific effluvia, and so I just got gravity, you know, to report on it, and I said, wow, this is great. Because it means I don't have to do anything because there's no such thing as gravity. So after the 3 weeks was up, you know, everybody had to stand up in class and report. You know, I remember Gwendolyn Smith had gotten the nose, and she was talking about the olfactory things and how food has little particles that go up in your nose, and you know, and you can get fat smelling stuff, and you know, and that's why cooks are always bulbous. And don't ever live over a pizza place because you'll be fat yourself from the air coming up through the boards. And so then I said, well, Paul, now would you get up and inform us about gravity? And I just got up there and I just stood there. And she said, did you do this assignment? I said, no. And why not? Well, because I didn't have to. I said, what do you mean you don't have to? He says, well, this is about gravity, but gravity doesn't exist. And so this, okay, down to the office. You know, I mean, the rest of the kids are literally rolling in the aisles. I mean, it was like, because they never had they met a concept where everybody assumed that gravity exists. You know, and so then I was not laughing. I was completely serious about this. We went to see Mr. Tripp. You know, you sit on a sort of like the Group W bench. You know, when you're going in the Army, you know, you're waiting to go in to see the principal. He comes in and he says, well, Paul, so there's no such thing as gravity, is there? He says, well, we'll see about that. So he picks up the phone and he's dialing and ring. And my mother answers the phone, and it says, Mrs. Laffoley says, we have a young man here who doesn't believe in gravity. He says, oh, you want to talk to my husband? See, my father happened to be there at the time for some reason, so he puts it on the phone, and then buzz, 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 and then he slams the phone down, and he says, put the kid back in the class and shut up. Well, what had happened was that a big argument had started about the nature of gravity with my father. His position was actually quite similar to René Descartes, the vortex system, where the celestial bodies are sending off things, and so that they are creating an equilibrium in space. And so it was the first, he sort of connected that with the Einsteinian view that the universe is infinite but bounded, so there'd be some edge where all this stuff would hit. I remember, like in New York one time, we were walking along 42nd Street, when 42nd Street really was, where they had that freak show that Tiny Tim used to sing at, and next to it they had a fantastic joke shop and stuff, and in the window they had a ball, a ping pong ball, being attacked by jets of air, and so it'd go in the middle and then spin. He says, "See, that's it. That's how the universe operates." And so to him that was the complete story. I mean, he had vague notions that he got from his father, and he had put it all together. Besides not believing in gravity, he did believe in what today would be considered the heartbeat of the paranormal, and practiced it too. I mean, he was so good that my grandfather took him to the it was the Exeter Street Theater. This was the first spiritualist temple in the United States, and it was the best one. It had a big stage, and and every weekend they would get the best of the best up there, and they would trot them out and have them do something. This is where William James found Lenora Piper. The person he called, the reason he called her the White Crow. In other words, the exception to all the other mediums that were phony, that she actually accomplished it, and she was discovered, just wandering in and tryouts. It's like people have tryouts for everything. What is the American Idol? So it was like this was the American Idol from the 19th into the 20th century. And every single week people will go in there and they'd be rated. And then thrown off the stage if they couldn't do anything. My father was never. What he did was this. In 1920, in the I guess it's the October issue, October 22nd issue of Scientific American, Thomas Alva Edison placed in there an enormous thing that was almost like an ad. I mean, it was a puff piece about him in inventing a device to aid being a medium. And so my father and my grandfather made one of these, and it was like a box, and then a like a gramophone shaped cone, and that was filled with potassium permanganate, then slices of quartz crystal, which are piezoelectric, that are almost like the way you would place polarization, so that they were stacked up. So it was a very fine looking instrument. It was like a classic 19th century instrument that if you put it in the Smithsonian, no one would know what it was for, because there's a lot of things in there that are like that. So my father put this on the dining room table, and he said, what this does is that this will communicate with the dead. My mother was out of the room. She always had a real trouble with this stuff, and so he took the device. In other words, he had electrodes in the hand. The instrumentality in the 19th century often involved using electricity, like the Wimshurst electrostatic generator. I mean, people used to get high on doing that. That even worked up till in Arnie Woo Ginsburg, this guy who was a disc jockey on WMEX. who was involved with doing with house Jews until Timothy Leary said stop that and get into acid. And so he took the things and then he went into this trance and he began to speak in a different voice. And I got really scared out of my skull. I mean, I was almost getting out of the room because, like, you always hear the voice that a person that you know speaks, but to suddenly speak in a different voice that had none of the overtone series, it was a completely different voice. And it was a person who had committed suicide. And it turned out that it was something, it was somebody from the Phippen farm. You know, so this is like, so some of these things, you know, start to recycle in the situation. Because I remember that the Phippens were always kind of very weird, you know, uncanny, you know, and never always kept to themselves. But so he was literally, what we were doing is attempting to convince this guy that the events of the reason why, you know, he'd lived such a repressed life, the mother, you know, had turned him into a drunk, you know, and she was so horrible and this kind of stuff. And so he never had a life and he just committed suicide. And they said, it's time to go. And I'm hearing this other voice from my father. And then when it was over, I mean, he talked in his normal voice again. And I said, what the hell was that? And he says, that was that I'm a medium, but this helped me, and it was like a range pickup. Apparently what Edison had come up with is a way to localize the activity. Because when you just say, well, I'm going to do a seance now, you have to have something local. It's like you're in a house, and something where the ghost has a high emotional attachment to the surroundings. And so he wanted to make sure that this device would respond to that. I've done some things with mediumship. I'm probably not as good as my father was with that. I mean, the ability to surprise people was an incredible strength. You know, because in other words, he had created such an aura of conservatism and you know, and the social thing and the bank and this kind of stuff, and then suddenly to do all this other stuff. It's like most people never believe in the youth of their parents, and so here was like something beyond that.
This is Paul's library. As he grew older, his quest for knowledge led him to study architecture at Harvard University.
And then I go to the Harvard Graduate School of Design and get thrown out. Well, I said I started out, you know, thinking, wow, this is, you know, this is going to work. I'm like, people like my stuff. People from higher years would come down to see my buildings. You know, 1962, I'm in mid-presentation. And so there was one guy who was our engineer. It was a huge fat guy, and he's 400 pounds. We call him the concentrated load. And he was the actual connection between myself and being grand juried out. And so in my mid-presentation, he comes up and he grabs me by the elbow. There's a place where there's a nerve, you know, like the funny bone, and he squeezes it like hell. And he says, I want you to go to the office right now. And that was the first that I heard, that I even realized that something was up. And then I went there, and the secretary said, well, I'm going to give you this letter, so you've been kicked out. You had a grand jury that was going on at that day. And I said, what is a grand jury? They said, well, we take all of the people that have been your teachers, we take all of your projects, we put them in a room, the dean goes in there and he locks the door. And they basically say, should we kick this guy for a field goal or not? And they just make that decision right there. Because I would get funny marks. Like other people got like single letters, you know, like A, B, C, B minus. I got diphthongs. Like A, E. You know, in other words, two vowels connected together. And I would say, why do I say other people with single grades. Why am I getting this thing? And he said, well, that's your grade. And I said, what does it mean? I said, A for architecture, E for engineering. He says, no, it's like that we love the idea, but we think you can't execute it. And I said, well, can't you average it out to a C? He says, no, that's the way it stands. So they were saying other things like I was too involved in what I was doing. And I said, what do you mean? I said, here, I'm in a professional school. Isn't this the time of super involvement? He said, no. In other words, you have to develop involvement like that. And I said, well, is there a safe involvement level, like a safe suds level in a washing machine? That was not a smart thing to say. Because then at that point, I knew it was really over, you know.
This is an example of Laffoley architecture. It's a bridge from the Earth to the Moon. By using the Moon's orbit, the bridge creates a giant motor that would solve the Earth's energy crisis. The ends of the bridge would be constructed out of double-layered geodesic domes that would rotate within each other, hovering 10 miles above the Earth. They would act as an atomic train and deliver goods anywhere on Earth. The bridge itself is a heavy-duty plastic tube that could be used for space transport. Plants would be allowed to grow up through the tube, and eventually they would cover the entire surface of the moon and make it inhabitable for humans and other animals.
And so immediately I go to my uncle, who was an architect working in Cape Cod. He was also a very canny person. He discovered that, rich women of indeterminate age who were pulling their husbands along on a leash would buy these little tiny Cape Cod houses, you know, to buy into Cape Cod. And since they were so small, says, what he would do is find a lot. If there was a house on it, he'd take the house off and he'd build up one of these little jobs, and then wait for the inevitable phone call. And he says, I must have this house. And they'd go in, and he'd put in like some real antiques, and then fill the rest of it with junk, you know, so it looked like they're selling a furnished home. And about 6 months later, the inevitable second call would be, so I got to get the hell out of this thing. It's horrible, because if you've ever been in an out-of-scale house, you can't live there. You know, and so he'd keep reselling those, and he'd make more. And now, when he discovered that Philip Johnson was doing little follies, that were like small versions of the Lincoln Center, you know, at his home in New Canaan, Connecticut, he claimed that Philip Johnson was ripping him off. I mean, he was a really funny guy who gave a bad name to militant ignorance. And he simply would found nothing attractive about modern architecture. He would go to every lecture on architecture, you know, by prominent architects, and he'd write down notes, and he'd send these elaborately constructed letters to, like, the Boston Society of Architects, why this guy should be, his license should be revoked, and he was going to destroy the profession, you know, that we are involved in, you know, like trying to be connected to these people. And then eventually they said, please don't send any more letters to us, because it interrupts all our work, because people spend all their time laughing at your letters. I remember the first day that I got kicked out of Harvard Graduate School of Design. I thought that I should go see him, and so he was in there composing a letter, and before I got through the threshold, he said, "No, you can't work for me." And I said, I don't want to work for you. I just, you know, maybe you can give me some advice or something, you know, and this kind of thing. And he happened to be writing a letter about somebody that I had never known about before. It was on some of his work was pictured on the cover of Progressive Architecture. This is the architect, Frederick John Kiesler. Let's see, 1890 to 1965. He came from Austria. He was the youngest member to enter the Gestalt movement, and he taught at the Bauhaus in the elementarist section for a while, a short while. And in 1925, he came to the United States. He was known. He was known basically as a set designer and worked for Juilliard. And then taught a course in architecture at Columbia on co-realism. That's what he was calling what he was doing. And he became part of the permanent avant-garde of New York. When Marcel Duchamp, who came over in 1912, ran out of cash, he went over to Kiesler's and he started living with him, you know, and stayed there for quite a while. To work with him is like having the keys of the city handed to you, you know, that kind of thing. You know, and I'm sitting there, my eyes are bulging out like Jim Carrey in The Mask, you know. I said, I can't believe this. And so he said he was writing this letter about Kiesler to the Boston Society of Architects, and he said, well, I can give you one piece of advice. Never, under any circumstances, have anything to do with this guy. So I realized that I was dealing with a person who was capable of absolute inverse knowledge. So I'm going to do the exact opposite of what he tells me. The next day, I'm on a train to New York, you know, knocking on Kiesler's door. And he was at 56 7th Avenue, you know, which is down, way down in Lower Manhattan. And I happened to be carrying 2 suitcases, but they were filled with stuff to show him. So he immediately says, well, you can't stay here. And I thought now he was rejecting me because I had written him 17 letters, you know, and trying to, you know, entice him to let me be his apprentice. And so I'm walking down the hall, and so you misunderstood me. I said that, no, in other words, I thought because you were bringing suitcases that you're going to try and live in my apartment. I said, no, I was stuff I was going to show you. So I showed him models and drawings and that kind of stuff, and he said, these things are made with love, you know, which I like, with a kind of a medieval attitude towards working. And then so he said, okay, you can be my apprentice. Right? And then he said, but with a codicil saying, I can't pay you much, so you're going to have to get a survival job. So that's why I went out and started walking around, and I would go to different places, and they'd say, well, can you do renderings? No. Can you do working drawings? No. Can you do this? No. And then they said, well, you can't work here. Finally, I walked in the Emery Roth's office, and I said the same thing. He says, great, we'll put you right in the design group. And I said, wait a minute. I said, what is it? And the reason is that every office has to have a design group. But see, this was the inverse of an office, where the production staff, where they made all the money, and that's the reason why they were there. So the designers, that was simply for show. And so that's why I was in it. But it suddenly became a strange thing, because the next job that came in was the World Trade Center. And and then we have this meeting, and this board meeting, and Yamasaki comes in, and he's this little tiny guy, and he has this beautiful model and a big pile of papers, and he taps it on the top and says, boys, fill her up. And somebody said, do you want high test or regular? It was a way of describing gasoline at that time. And so he becomes livid, leaves, and then never comes back. And so we think we lost the job. And then, but 2 weeks later, they write and call up and say that they want us to have a presentation in 2 weeks. So we suddenly have something to do. And we're literally designing the entire interior of the building. Well, first he has two buildings with a space in between, like this vibrating visual space. I'm looking at the floor area. Each are 1 square acre. And then with 18 elevator banks, three sets of them, the area is starting to be eaten away. The service core eats away, so you've got really an enlarged corridor space around that. And so it's hard to rent to people who would want open, flat space, because this is when office landscaping was starting to come in as an idea. And so I immediately got the idea, if you had bridges across every 5th level, like 17 bridges, there would be places where a larger company could then take advantage of the horizontal spread. And that's when I get fired, because he didn't want anything to disturb the prism purity of those 2 towers. Yamasaki's position and his ego is up front is that he thought that if anyone was negative about it, they were trying to stop it from being the tallest building in the world. In 1972, they realized they only had 2 years left to call this the tallest buildings in the world. Because if they had taken the time to do everything they needed to do, to put all the asbestos on the structure, and that way, it would have ended up that you would have had the tallest buildings for maybe 20 minutes, because the Sears Tower in Chicago was going up as fast as it could go to try to get ahead of it. The case is that fast-tracking this thing into existence resulted in its destruction. The whole business of like why the thing stayed up at all, had to do entirely with the X-bracing. And as long as the things were okay in relation to seismic resistance, that's earthquake resistance, the engineers felt that was sufficient, because they kept claiming if a plane hit it, nothing would happen. They were thinking that the plane would bounce off and fall to the ground, off of this material, which is patently absurd. I mean, the plane penetrated it instantly. And as a result, of things like the flaming and all of the of the fuel, the jet fuel, completely melted stuff, and so that those floors started to drop, and the X-bracing gave away so very, very easily. But my suggestion was to have the bridges connect into the X-bracing within the thing, have the whole thing welded, so that you would have stability for those two. It would allow people to go back and forth, no matter which one was hit or burning. They'd have some place to escape, and as a result, it also would help keep the thing up probably a lot longer, maybe 4 or 5 hours longer, before they came down, because it would have added stability.
After getting fired, Laffoley became further interested in creating greater structural stability by bridging and linking different constructions together. His search for knowledge led him to plant grafting and his design for Das Erpflanhaus, or the primordial plant house. Inspired by the poet Goethe's search for the universal leaf organ that could be used to invent new types of plants, Laffoley proposes to use ginkgo biloba to graft deciduous and coniferous vegetation together into a giant treehouse. The world's growing population could plant a few seeds and solve the problem of affordable housing. Mature homes would be self-sustaining. They would regulate heating and cooling processes, turn raw sewage into reusable mulch, and generate energy through photosynthesis. At night, plants genetically engineered with luciferase, an enzyme naturally found in fireflies, would provide light. Eventually, communities of homes would be grafted together, connected by sequoia trees, until the earth became a giant mega-vegetable, a world treehouse. Within the books of sketches for Das Erpflanhaus, Laffoley has included a chart that maps out the nature of a zeitgeist. A zeitgeist, or time spirit, reflects a generation's cultural outlook. In our present-day society, we live in a polluted and overpopulated world. The plant house would be an environmentally sound solution to the growing problem of mass housing. After September 11th, Paul Laffoley started to design a replacement for the Twin Towers. The sketches have much of the same visionary flair that is found in Das Erpflanhaus. Laffoley proposes to construct a building designed in 1908 by the Spanish architect Antonio Gaudí. It is an early skyscraper, originally intended to be built in the exact same location as the World Trade Center.
Well, we have to go back to 1958. Here I am, a freshman at Brown University. Okay, right. And saying, you know, what am I going to study? You know, I just gotten out of prep school where I had a lot of Latin, so I went in the classics department. I wanted to do things in art, and so I got in these courses that were seminar courses for freshmen, and one of them was a course given by Professor William H. Geordie, who people didn't recognize what he was really doing. So he just landed at Brown because he couldn't get tenure any other place, and he was literally trying to document all American architecture from 1900 on up. So the modern part of heroic modernism for the United States. And so he had 800 pages of notes that dealt with every single thing that an American architect would do or thought about or anything. And so in the course, in passing, he just mentioned, you know, because somebody in class asked, well, what about Gaudi? Had he ever anything to do with the United States? And he said, yeah, he wanted a hotel to be built on Manhattan. If the gods had been propitious at that time, in 1908, that building would have been there. It would have been a hotel. It would have been five large halls that would have been connected to the five major continents in the world, where goods and services would be displayed. There'd be orchestras in each one, you know, to help, you know, to keep the mood going while people were buying and selling. Gaudi actually produced a World Trade Center. Here is a chance to do an authentic piece of posthumous architecture, and the reason why I say this is not copying a building, say like the way the Japanese have a copy of the Eiffel Tower. that's not posthumous architecture. Posthumous architecture is something that's not a pastiche. It is a new building done by a person who's dead. Gaudi's hotel as a complete plan is actually the part that's not complete, because it's presented in a kind of very abstract way, where it comes down to the earth and then it abstractly connects. Okay, this cannot be in a real proposal, and so here is like a building that is vague enough so that people's imagination, when they design it, can work, but at the same time, you have architectural historians that know Gaudi's work, and there are plenty of them, because you just go to Barcelona and you can spend a lifetime studying all the details. I'm talking about people investigating the design process every step of the way, so that the designer has to be challenged in showing that what they are doing is actually what Gaudi would want.
The notion of turning a Gaudi-designed building into the next World Trade Center would not have been possible if Paul Laffoley hadn't designed a time machine. It's his masterpiece. It's also his most difficult project to understand. The time machine is housed in a piece of physically alive architecture genetically created in the shape of a Klein bottle. A Klein bottle is a topological structure with no inside or outside. Twisting, turning, or stretching can alter no point on the Klein bottle. It is a protective encasing for the time traveler and his instruments. An orgone motor powers the time machine. Orgonomy is a controversial science founded by Viennese psychologist Wilhelm Reich. Reich believed in a universal energy, measured in orgons, which is responsible for the creative force in nature. The motor taps into this resource. And this is the actual time machine. It's extremely challenging to understand how it actually works. It involves pendulums, gyroscopes, crystals, structured wormholes, and even human consciousness. Despite the vagueness in the description, it's been rumored that if one were actually able to build a time machine, it would work. This device is called the agnostician. It allows the user to engineer his doubt or belief in order to survive the seemingly bizarre worldviews that exist in the deep future or past. This is the pinpoint where the time machine touches the ground. The Klein bottle hovers above the Earth by relying on electromagnets. If the time machine rested entirely on the ground, it could upset the universe. In the middle of Laffoley's design is an alchemist who is about to release energy by dividing the metaphorical philosopher's egg with his sword. By understanding the nature of time, Laffoley can apply it to posthumous architecture. The original World Trade Center may have stood up longer if Paul's idea was used. Now he can fix the mistake by figuratively going back in time and resurrecting the Gaudi building, another plan yet to be put into action. Gaudi's building's perfect for the site because it was originally intended to go there. Here's what Laffoley plans for the interior of this forgotten skyscraper.
So my idea was, first of all, to accept, of course, because you have to, and the defined infrastructure that's there, but then to produce another special platform upon which the Gaudi Hotel would be built, and I was thinking that it would be modeled after the Parc Grill, like the one where there's wavy places where people sit down, and to actually create a Gaudi-esque landscape. You know, like on the top of these very large apartment building in Barcelona. He actually had planned to do a Virgin Mary on the top of this thing, but instead he had this you know, kind of garden of air conditioning units, you know, where you see these dairy whip swirls, you know, that are done in tile, you know, and all this kind of stuff. So that I wanted to have that as the place from which the hotel would come out of, so that you would come, you could drive under the whole structure, because there would have to be places where tunnels where cars would go through, places where people would line up to go in this and go up either by elevators or curved stairs, and then emerge on this next platform, which would be this kind of garden, and then you could then have the actual hotel. Now, the first level would be a place where you would have the actual memorial to the site. You know, say there's a memorial like inside of, and then so around that would be with VR and other kinds of enhanced theater. You know, like scenes of the buildings collapsing, being hit. You know, all of the visuals that have been collected, because there's an enormous amount of filming, even to the ones where people jumped out the side. I mean, people said they should never show that, and I remember on 9/11, I watched people jump out of the building because they would rather die by hitting the ground rather than being burned to death inside that. And so the emotion of those people is invested in that spot, and so the sense of preserving the sanctity of that spot has got to be more than just something where you have two little square boxes and you walk around it, you know, like almost like wastebaskets. The fact that the thing imploded and in a sense made a huge hole in the ground. I wanted to take that round area. In the center of this would be a sloping curve, which would then be divided in polar axes with a logarithmic spiral, you know, an equiangular spiral that would go into the center, and that would create enough flat facets to produce the effect of infinity. When you do it with a one and a two-way mirror, and you don't see the light source and you don't see yourself, it looks like you're going into deep space. And so this would be the place where people could overlook it. There would be a huge pendulum, and there would be ways in which you could like affect this. In other words, like an exercise in psychokinesis, because this is where loved ones died. So I suspect that there are lots of ghosts there, and they need to be treated, and that what would be nice is to get that involved in it, so that the thing wouldn't become a haunted castle. You know, in that way, where there would be a healing process, not only for the relatives, but for the now called officially in paranormal terms the entities, you know, would be able to leave. Directly above that are five. You could call them spaces dedicated to the five continents of the earth. And what Gaudi planned for that was literally a true World Trade Center, because this is where people from those different parts of the world would bring artifacts, goods that they were building, you know, parts of their culture, you know, there's some music, their literature, you know, and they would exchange with people. They could come and see this. They could enjoy dining. You know, there'd be a theater, and so there are 5 proscenium theaters. You know, in the renderings, you see orchestras playing. You know, in that way, but other things could go on, and you know, you had seats for like, say, like 500 people could be in there at a time, and then there'd be plenty of room to display things. Directly above that is the plenum, where it'd have all the building systems. This would be also involved with a model of the structure of how the building is actually built, because he always did that. Now the next floor up is what would be the largest theater in the world. This is the place where they'd all want to come to have like enormous rallies. It would almost be like a small football field in there, you know, kind of a theater where there would be there'd be no columns in it, completely column free. So it would have again that egg-shaped thing where you could project imagery all around you, and so you could be doing all sorts of things in there. Okay, then immediately above that is this 400-foot, what is essentially a chapel, you know, where you have in the center, you have the skeletal 1/6 size of the Statue of Liberty.
Now, he admired Eiffel very much, and he knew just exactly the reason why the Statue of Liberty was able to stand up, because the Statue of Liberty, the book, you know, and this thing like that, if you had a solid statue, it would have fallen over. So, Eiffel made it work because of a spiraling shear stress, meaning as that thing moved, he was able to come up with a structure that resisted that movement. Now, Gaudi used a smaller version of it with just the skeleton inside the top part of the building that was literally the chapel.
So you can actually see why the Statue of Liberty works. Surrounding that are pedestals for the for statues of the presidents of the United States, and he made places so you'd have enough. He assumed that this would go to the year 3000. So he had a sense of United States lasting in it, and this has a couple of balconies, and then at the sides, where you have the steel structure, these would be large enough so you'd have traveling elevators, and so I thought that on top of that small elevator shaft when you get out, that you'd place the sphere that used to be the symbol of the World Trade Center. You know, it was broken. It's now in a little park right near Ground Zero. You take that and you'd mount that on the top of the elevator shaft, so you could turn that into actually a sculpture base, and so you're coming out of a sculpture base and going in and then looking up and seeing it. So it would be like that sphere was resurrected in the sphere of all space. Now this is where I thought that you could start to put in some physically alive stuff, with like the thing actually growing, because there's very little about that. I mean, he said, well, this should look like a sea urchin, because his whole point was to design from nature directly. This is why he is a complete precursor of biological architecture, or architecture that's physically alive. He claimed himself that he was the last true Gothic architect, and when you look at the high Gothic, those things look like vegetables made out of stone. What I anticipated, in other words, like from the base, you're starting with traditional materials, and so you've got steel, you've got reinforced concrete, shells. It would have to be made in a factory. At certain points, you'd start to get more and more towards what is like a natural thing. So that's why I was talking before about a process where you take shaped forms from a steel mesh, like strong steel mesh, and you'd place them in seawater. Like you'd probably go down the Hudson to where you're getting in seawater that's mixing with it, and with about 70 volts of direct current, you'd leave that in the water for a couple of months, and you take it out, and now you have a calcium carbonate shell, which is just as strong as reinforced concrete. And so that becomes the next part that goes on it as you're going to the top. And so finally, when you get to the sphere of all space, then you can start to actually get into something that is physically alive, because it's small enough to be able to use vegetative grafting techniques to make these spires come out, because and then some of the shape of the thing that you're in, so that you're actually ending up walking into a vegetable. You'd be using plastic surfaces. Butyrite is a physically alive plastic that can be grafted onto something that's alive and keep its livingness. The plant forms, there are certain plant forms that are extremely hardy that are parts of the philodendron. Now the philodendron, I found that you really can't kill those things. Like I have a philodendron growing in my studio that just popped out of its pot and dove into a big vat of water that doesn't drain, and it's sustaining itself.
I know where it was supposed to go, and in other words, that's part of its history, and so to build it in another location would be to vitiate the design in a very vital part. Well, there really isn't another place to do it. There isn't an open space that large where the way it was supposed to have some space around it, for the landscaping and everything to do it. I mean, it's got to go there, or I would say forget it.
The reality, I think, is literally growing, because every time I tell it to somebody, they'll say, well, gee, that sounds like a lot better idea than what I've seen. And why isn't that down in the Winter Garden with a model? So people can vote on that. And that what I think has been happening is the process that's been going on by the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, the politicians, and very wealthy New York design firms, is that they're trying to keep out this kind of thing. In other words, a wild card is what they don't want to have happen, because this literally is like that. But I think it's making sense to people who want something that's different than what they see, because a lot of those designs looks like just another New York building, and it is not just another New York building. I mean it's a memorial. It's a revival of a historical moment. It's a connection into history that goes behind the 9/11. Because 9/11 was a national tragedy. And so the healing process of putting in something that would have been there prior to that becomes to me exciting. Where you've healed history itself, in the process. this helps you out, right?
Yeah.
That's what people normally call painting or art. In other words, like dealing with your perception, and you know, and beefing it up, and that so that the work is an indication of how you have learned to deal with your own perception.
To date, none of Laffoley's architectural designs have been executed. Hypothetically, if all of Paul Laffoley's inventions were to be built, the age of postmodernism would end and a new age would begin. The Larroque would be a passage in time that combined the sensibilities of the Bauhaus and the Baroque. The Bauhaus wanted to unify the arts under architecture with the aims of creating a utopia. The Baroque also wanted to unify the arts, but as a means to transform life into theater. Larroque means utopian theater. Postmodernism is concerned with time. It's perversely fixated on fads and fashion. The Larroque will be a reaction against this. The invention of the time machine will make it an eternal age. This is a painting of what the universe will eventually become. It's the Atheopolis, an utopist community that Laffoley has created out of involved mythology. Even if you don't believe what Paul Laffoley says, it's important to believe in Paul Laffoley. He's populated an entire universe within his head. Sometimes his world touches ours for a brief moment, in the proposal for the construction of a New York skyscraper, for example. The result is brilliant. The sheer possibility of it makes us exclaim, "What if?" It inspires our imaginations, and this is what drives our civilization another inch forward. It's important to be reminded that Paul Laffoley is not an extraterrestrial. He's as human as anyone else. We all start out with the same amount of information, but Paul simply chooses to take it a little further.
Jesus.
What was that?
Wow. It's a spontaneous Kundalini rise.
Explain that. What?
Well, I mean that in your in your back, near the spinal column is winding these psychic channels, the Ida, the Pingala, and the Sushumna. It's the third channel, and what they do is they surround the major chakras of the body, and so when the chi energy or the ki or whatever you want to call it, prana, it comes through. In other words, sometimes it rushes, and so what it does, it creates a wave form, and so your entire spine operates like a wave. Because if it didn't, there would be so many things that would break your spine. Like if you hit, it waves and it takes the impact. So this is the same thing.